If you like this story, please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next exciting stories. And now let's enjoy the story.
The golden light of the late afternoon sun bathed Central Park in a warm glow, illuminating the trees and casting long shadows over the pathways. The park was alive with the sounds of children laughing, joggers huffing past, and the occasional rustle of squirrels darting through the grass. Among the countless visitors that day, Emma Carter sat on her usual wooden bench, her delicate fingers resting lightly on the harness of her guide dog, Ranger. Even though she couldn't see the beauty of the setting sun filtering through the leaves, she could feel it. She tilted her face upward, letting the warmth of the light kiss her flawless skin. Emma had once been the kind of woman people turned to look at twice, not just for her striking emerald green eyes, but for the way she carried herself with effortless grace. She had been blessed with long, wavy, chestnut-brown hair that cascaded over her shoulders, high cheekbones, and full lips that held the kind of smile that could stop a conversation. A woman who had once been admired, envied even, for her charm, her wit, and her undeniable beauty. But that was before the accident, before everything was taken from her. She had been 23 years old, fresh out of college, full of dreams, ambition, and love for life. She had planned to move to New York, work as a journalist, and travel the world. But all of that changed on a night she would never forget. It had been raining heavily that night. Emma was in the passenger seat, laughing at something her fiancé Liam had said. They had been together for 4 years, their love the kind of thing that seemed untouchable, until fate proved otherwise. A truck driver, drunk and speeding, had run a red light at an intersection. Emma never heard the impact. All she remembered was a deafening crash, the shattering of glass, the feeling of weightlessness as their car was hurled into a spin, metal twisting and screeching against the pavement. Then silence, a horrifying, crushing silence. When she woke up in the hospital days later, the first thing she saw was nothing. A void. Blackness. Her eyes were open, but her world was gone. Doctors told her that shards of glass from the shattered windshield had severed her optic nerves, rendering her permanently blind. Her parents wept. Friends pitied her. But the worst part, the most unbearable pain, was learning that Liam had not survived. Her dreams, her love, her sight, all stolen in one cruel moment. She had begged for it to be a mistake, screamed in denial. But fate didn't care. The Emma Carter that once existed had died that night, and in her place was a woman forced to rebuild herself in a world she could no longer see. For months, Emma had refused to leave her apartment. She could still hear the whispers of those who felt sorry for her. People who once admired her now looked at her with nothing but pity. It had taken her nearly a year to adjust, to accept that she would never see a sunrise again, never meet someone's gaze, never look into the mirror and recognize herself. Then one day, she met Ranger. The German Shepherd had been assigned to her as a guide dog, and though she had no idea at the time, Ranger was more than just a service animal. He was a soldier. Before coming into her life, Ranger had been part of an elite K-9 unit, trained for combat and high-risk missions. He had once worked alongside military personnel in war zones, detecting explosives, tracking enemies, and saving countless lives. But when his service ended, he had been deemed unfit for duty due to an injury and was discarded, sent to live out his remaining years in obscurity. He had been trained to protect, to fight, to never back down from a threat. But now his job was simple: to guide a blind woman through a world that had left her behind. From the moment Emma took his leash, she felt something different. She wasn't alone anymore. Ranger wasn't just a guide, he was a warrior. And today, in Central Park, he sensed a threat long before she did. Ranger had sensed the danger before Emma even knew something was wrong. His ears twitched, his body went rigid, and his nose flared as he picked up the scent of something, someone, predatory. Across the park, Derek Slade stood near his black motorcycle, a smirk curling across his lips. Slade was the kind of man who enjoyed breaking things. He had spent most of his life stealing, fighting, and leaving destruction in his wake. He had no respect for rules, laws, or the people around him. And today, his target was a blind woman and her dog. He hated well-behaved dogs, the ones that followed orders, sat still, and obeyed. And he especially hated women who thought they were untouchable. With a slow swagger, he flicked his cigarette onto the pavement and started toward her, his heavy boots thudding against the ground like a warning. Ranger's ears flattened, his body tensed like a coiled spring. Emma, though unaware of what was coming, felt the air around her change. The lazy hum of the park had shifted. Conversations became hushed, footsteps slowed, people were watching, but no one said a word. Slade stopped just a few feet away from her. His presence loomed like a dark shadow. "Hey there, sweetheart," he sneered. Emma's fingers clenched around Ranger's harness. Something in her gut screamed that she was in danger. Then, before she could even react, Slade's heavy hand shot out and slapped Ranger across the face. A crack echoed through the air. Ranger didn't move. Not yet, but Emma felt his entire body go rock solid beneath her touch. "Let's see if he's really as obedient as he looks," Slade mocked. Then, with a cruel smirk, he raised his boot, intending to kick the dog. Emma gasped. "Don't you dare." But it was too late. The moment his foot moved, Ranger did too. In a blur of black and tan, the dog lunged. The soldier had awoken. And this time, he wasn't holding back. Derek Slade had made a grave mistake. The moment his steel-toed boot lifted off the ground, aiming for Ranger's ribs, the German Shepherd's instincts erupted like a long-dormant storm. The world around them seemed to slow as Ranger moved with the precision of a trained warrior. His body twisted with lightning-fast reflexes, dodging the attack with calculated ease. The brutal kick meant to hurt him struck only empty air. Before Slade even realized what had happened, Ranger had already countered. In a flash, the once obedient, silent guide dog became a force of pure power and discipline. His massive frame lunged forward, slamming into Slade's leg with such force that the man stumbled backward. The crowd gasped. Phones were already recording as Slade hit the ground hard, his hands scraping against the pavement. His shocked expression turned into one of pure rage as he scrambled back to his feet. "What the hell?" he spat, glaring at the dog. Ranger didn't move. He stood tall, his powerful body tense, his fur bristling. His head was lowered slightly, his sharp eyes locked on Slade's every movement. His entire posture screamed discipline, control, and unshakable confidence. This wasn't just a dog defending himself. This was a former military canine recognizing a threat and neutralizing it. Emma, still gripping his harness, had felt every shift, every vibration in his muscles. She turned toward where she knew Slade had fallen, her breath coming faster. "What just happened?" she demanded. But no one answered her, because every single person watching was too stunned to speak. Slade wiped his bleeding palms against his jeans and let out a cruel, humorless laugh. "This damn mutt just attacked me," he roared, pointing at Ranger with an accusatory glare. "You all saw it." The crowd murmured. Emma's pulse spiked. No. This wasn't how it happened. Ranger had defended himself. He had been provoked. But Slade wasn't done. "This is a dangerous animal," he shouted, his voice rising in fake outrage. "He should be put down before he hurts someone for real." The word sent a cold, paralyzing fear through Emma's chest. "No," she snapped. "That's not true. He didn't do anything wrong." A murmur spread through the onlookers. Some shook their heads at Slade, disgusted by his obvious attempt to twist the truth. But others hesitated. Emma felt the shift in the air. Doubt. Fear. The very thing that killed innocent dogs every day. A woman near the front of the crowd took a step back, looking at Ranger nervously. "That dog did move really fast," she murmured. "What if he attacked someone else?" Emma's stomach dropped. Slade played into the fear. "This dog is a damn menace," he yelled. "If it weren't for me, one of you could have been next." A few people nodded in agreement. A whisper rippled through the growing crowd. Should the dog be taken away? Emma's fingers dug into Ranger's fur. No, this couldn't be happening. Slade had tried to hurt her dog, and now he was playing the victim? He was twisting reality, and people were falling for it. Emma's throat tightened, her voice desperate. "Ranger is my guide dog. He's never attacked anyone. That man, he hit him first. You all saw it." Some people hesitated. Others shifted uncomfortably, looking down at their phones. Slade saw the uncertainty. He smirked. He knew how to manipulate people. "Dogs like that are unpredictable," he continued, his voice oily and condescending. "They snap. One second they're calm, the next they're tearing out your throat." Emma's breath shook. He was trying to make Ranger sound like a monster. Like a dangerous, vicious animal. Like something that should be taken away from her. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She couldn't afford to look weak. "This dog is all I have," she said, her voice cracking. "He's my eyes, my protector. And now you're trying to take him from me?" A few people looked away, guilt flickering in their expressions, but others still wavered. Slade knew he was winning. Then an older voice cut through the noise. A voice from the past. "That's no ordinary dog." The crowd turned. An older man stepped forward, his gait strong despite the weathered military cap resting on his head. His piercing blue eyes locked onto Ranger, and for a brief moment, something flickered across his face. Recognition, admiration, respect. Slade sneered. "And what the hell do you know, old man?" The veteran ignored him. His gaze never left Ranger. "I know that stance," he said, voice calm and sure. "I know that discipline. That's a retired military K9. The crowd gasped. Even Emma's breath caught in her throat. "Ranger? A military dog?" The veteran stepped closer, nodding slowly. "You served, didn't you, boy?" His voice was softer now, almost reverent. Ranger's ears flicked. His stance didn't change, but there was something different in his expression. A flicker of recognition, like he had been seen for the first time in years. Slade scoffed, but the crowd was no longer on his side. People started murmuring. "That's a service dog. Wait, he was a soldier?" Then that biker guy was the one in the wrong. Slade's smirk vanished. He could feel the tide turning. The veteran folded his arms. "This dog spent years protecting our soldiers, and now you want to punish him for doing what he was trained to do?" Emma swallowed hard. Her fingers tightened on Ranger's leash. She had trusted this dog for 3 years. But she had never known, never imagined. He had been more than just her guide. He had been a warrior. And now, she would have to fight for him the way he had always fought for her. The murmur of the crowd swelled, a storm of conflicting opinions. Some looked at Ranger with newfound respect, their expressions shifting as they processed the truth. This wasn't just a dog. This was a trained protector, a veteran of battles they could never comprehend. But others still hesitated, swayed by fear, by the idea that an animal with such power was somehow dangerous. Emma felt the weight of injustice pressing down on her chest. How quickly the world turned against the innocent. How fast the truth was drowned beneath lies. She wouldn't let them take him. Not after everything. Not after what this dog had done for her. Emma took a deep, trembling breath and faced the crowd, not as a victim, but as someone who refused to let another injustice happen. "You all saw what happened," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "That man," she pointed toward Derek Slade, who was still trying to brush dirt off his jeans, "tried to kick my dog. Ranger didn't attack first. He didn't hurt anyone. He only did what he was trained to do, protect." Slade scoffed, but for the first time, he looked uncertain. "This dog is my eyes," Emma continued, her voice rising with emotion. "I live in darkness. I have to trust him with my life every single day, and he has never done anything to hurt anyone." She took a step forward, her hands clenched into tight fists. "But today, a man, a bully, decided that just because he could, he would hurt the one thing in this world that protects me. And now he wants you to believe that Ranger is dangerous?" Her voice broke on the last word. Ranger stood beside her, unmoving, but she could feel his steady presence grounding her. The veteran nodded in approval. His deep voice boomed across the park. "This isn't about a dangerous dog," he said, looking around at the bystanders. "It's about power. It's about how easy it is for people like him," he shot a cold glare at Slade, "to twist the story so they don't have to face the consequences of their own actions." Slade's smirk vanished completely. The crowd's energy shifted again, this time in Emma's favor. Whispers of agreement spread. "She's right. That biker guy was the one who started it." "Yeah, and the dog didn't even bite him." Slade's hands curled into fists. "Oh, so now we're all believing the blind chick over a normal person?" A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Emma's stomach turned. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to reduce her to nothing because of her blindness, but she wasn't going to be silenced. She lifted her chin. "You say that like it makes you look better, but all you just did was prove who the real coward is." A few people chuckled, and Slade's face darkened with rage. But before he could say anything else, another voice rang out. "Step away from the woman and the dog." A park ranger strode through the crowd, his uniform crisp and his expression unreadable. A few feet behind him, 2 police officers approached, their hands resting near their belts. Emma's heart pounded. This was it. This was the moment that would decide whether Ranger would go home with her or be ripped away forever. Slade immediately switched tactics, his voice oozing fake innocence. "Officer, thank God you're here," he said, gesturing toward Ranger like he was some kind of monster. "This dog attacked me. He's unstable. If I hadn't dodged him, he could have killed me." Emma felt sick. He wasn't just twisting the story now, he was rewriting it entirely. The park ranger's expression didn't change. "Is that so? I have proof," Slade insisted, his voice rising. "People here saw it. That mutt needs to be put down." Emma gasped. "Put down." The words sent ice-cold terror through her veins. "No, you don't," she blurted out. "You don't have any proof because you're lying. I have witnesses too." The veteran stepped forward. "I saw everything, officer. That man, he provoked the dog first. He tried to harm a service animal. Another woman in the crowd raised her phone, and I recorded it." Slade's face drained of color. The officers exchanged glances before one of them sighed heavily and turned toward Slade. "You do realize that assaulting a service dog is a felony, don't you?" Slade stiffened. "What?" The officer crossed his arms. "The law protects service animals. The penalty can include fines, community service, and even jail time depending on the severity of the attack. If the footage confirms what these people are saying, then you're the one who's in trouble." The color returned to Slade's face, in the form of rage. "This is bullsh." "Save it," the officer interrupted. "We'll be taking a look at that footage." Slade opened his mouth to argue, but he knew it was over. Emma's knees nearly buckled with relief. They weren't taking Ranger away. The injustice, the horrifying, stomach-churning injustice that had almost stolen the only thing she had left, was over. For now. Slade was issued a warning and escorted out of the park by the officers, his face burning with humiliation as people booed him. He would not be arrested today, but the officers made it clear that further investigation would be conducted. The crowd slowly dispersed, but a few people stayed behind. People who had once doubted Ranger's innocence now looked at him in awe. Emma crouched beside Ranger, her fingers threading through his fur. He pressed his weight against her, solid and unwavering. "You saved me again," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I almost lost you." Ranger didn't understand her words, but he felt the emotion behind them. And so, he did the only thing he could. He stayed by her side. Forever. The crowd had mostly dispersed, but the weight of what had just happened still pressed heavily on Emma Carter's chest. She remained crouched beside Ranger, one hand gripping his harness, the other threading through his thick fur. She could feel the tension in his body, a tension that had been there long before today. Her faithful guide dog had almost been taken from her, almost punished for protecting her. The injustice of it left a bitter taste in her mouth. She let out a shaky breath. "I won't let anyone hurt you, Ranger, ever." The older veteran, the one who had recognized Ranger for what he truly was, remained standing a few feet away, watching them in silence. After a long pause, he spoke. "I wasn't lying when I said that dog isn't ordinary." Emma turned her head toward him, her pulse still racing. "You knew?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The old man nodded. "I've seen hundreds of military dogs in my time. I know a soldier when I see one." Emma's fingers tightened in Ranger's fur. A soldier? That word felt too heavy, too important. She had always known Ranger was disciplined, intelligent, different from most dogs, but she had never questioned why. Until now. The veteran took a careful step closer. "Do you know where he came from?" Emma shook her head, suddenly feeling uneasy. "No one ever told me much. I was just given his file when I got him as a guide dog. I never thought to ask." The veteran let out a small exhale, his sharp eyes softening as he crouched down, just enough to meet Ranger's level. "Because no one tells people the truth about dogs like him," he murmured. Ranger stayed perfectly still, his dark eyes locked onto the old man's face, as if he recognized something familiar in him. Emma swallowed hard. "Tell me." The veteran studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I will." They found a quiet spot in the park, away from the chaos of what had just happened. The veteran introduced himself as Frank Holloway, a retired Marine who had worked alongside military K-9 units for over 20 years. He leaned forward slightly, his weathered hands clasped together as he spoke. "Your dog," he said, his voice low and steady, "was once known as Bravo." Emma stiffened. She had never known Ranger by any other name. "Bravo," she repeated, testing the word on her tongue. It felt foreign. Frank nodded. "He wasn't just a service dog. He was trained for combat. He served overseas in the Middle East, working with elite military teams. Dogs like him," he gestured toward Ranger, "are used for the most dangerous missions, tracking explosives, detecting enemy movement, protecting soldiers in the heat of battle." Emma's breath caught in her throat. She turned toward Ranger, her fingers gripping his fur tighter. "You've been through that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Ranger didn't move, didn't respond. But Emma felt the answer deep in her bones. Frank continued, "I didn't work with him personally, but I know how dogs like him are trained, and from the way he reacted today, from the way he stood his ground without fear, I'd bet my life that he was one of the best." Emma felt her chest tighten. She had spent 3 years with Ranger, depending on him for everything, but she had never realized how much he had already endured before he met her. She clenched her jaw. Why was he retired? Frank's gaze darkened. "They don't keep K9s forever," he said, his voice carrying the weight of something unspoken. "Some get too old, some get injured, and some," he exhaled heavily, "are discarded when they're no longer considered useful." Emma's stomach twisted. Discarded. The word burned in her mind. Ranger, Bravo, had risked his life for soldiers, had spent his best years in war, and when the time came he had been thrown away like he was nothing. She felt sick. She stroked his fur softly, guilt washing over her like a tidal wave. She had thought he was just a guide dog. She had never considered the possibility that he had once belonged to a world of violence and sacrifice. "Who was his handler?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Frank hesitated. "I don't know. But I can find out." Emma nodded slowly. "I need to know. I need to understand. Because this wasn't just about her anymore. This was about him." That night, as Emma sat in her small apartment, Ranger curled up beside her, his breathing steady. She couldn't shake the weight of what she had learned. She reached for the file that had come with him when she was first given him as a guide dog. She had never really looked at it before. Her fingers skimmed over the papers inside. Medical records, certification documents, basic training reports. But then, something caught her eye. A scar report. She swallowed hard as her fingers traced the words. Shrapnel wound, left hind leg. Gunfire wound, minor grazing healed. Her breath hitched. These weren't ordinary injuries, they were battle scars. And yet, despite everything, he had never shown her an ounce of weakness. Tears pricked her eyes. She had spent so long feeling sorry for herself, for losing her sight, for what had been taken from her. But what had been taken from him? A home, a partner, a life that had defined him. And now, he had been forced to start over. Just like her. She reached out, fingers brushing against the soft fur behind his ears. He stirred slightly but didn't move away. "I didn't know," she whispered, guilt laced in every syllable. "I should have known." Ranger lifted his head slightly, his dark eyes calm, steady, and in that moment she realized he didn't hold it against her. Because that was who he was. Loyal, unwavering, hers, no matter what. And now, she was determined to honor the life he had once lived. No more secrets, no more ignorance. She would find his former handler. She would learn his full story. And no matter what, she would fight for him, just as he had always fought for her. The night stretched long and silent in Emma's small apartment. The only sound was Ranger's steady breathing beside her, his large frame curled at her feet, always in reach. Even in sleep, his presence was constant, like a living shield between her and the world. But tonight, Emma couldn't sleep. Her fingers traced the edges of the medical report she had found in Ranger's file. Shrapnel wound, gunfire wound, military K9 unit. She had spent 3 years with him, depending on his guidance, trusting him with her life, but she had never truly understood what he had been through. She had never even asked. A lump formed in her throat. She had thought she was the broken one. She had spent years grieving the loss of her sight, mourning the life she would never have. But what about him? How much had he lost? How many times had he been left behind? A fresh surge of determination ran through her veins. She would find the man who had trained him. She would find the person Ranger had once belonged to. And she would finally understand the full story of the dog who had saved her. The next morning, Emma sat at her laptop, her fingers hesitating over the keys. How did you even begin to search for something like this? She typed in, "How to find retired military canine handlers," and hit enter. A dozen articles popped up, stories about war heroes and their canine partners, heartbreaking accounts of dogs left behind, reunions that had taken years to happen. Some of them were never reunited at all. Emma's heart clenched. She wouldn't let that happen to Ranger. Her hands moved faster, clicking through government pages, old military records, canine retirement organizations. Everything was buried under layers of bureaucracy. She spent hours on hold with different agencies, redirected to voicemail after voicemail. No one seemed to know or care how to help her find one dog's history. By late afternoon, she was ready to scream in frustration. Then, one of her emails finally got a response. Subject, request for military canine history. Bravo, Miss Carter, thank you for reaching out. We have confirmed that the canine you're inquiring about, registered as Bravo, served in a classified combat unit overseas. Due to security protocols, we cannot release his full service record. However, we are able to provide the name of his last known handler, Sergeant Jake Carter. Location, Montana. Please note that contacting retired handlers is at their discretion. Best Veterans Canine Assistance Program. Emma read the name over and over again. Jake Carter. Was that just a coincidence? Carter, her last name? Her breath hitched. Had fate always meant for her and Ranger to find each other? She had a name. She had a place. She had a chance. She wasn't going to waste it. A call from the past. Emma sat at her kitchen table, gripping her phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. She had spent the last hour debating whether to call. What if he didn't remember Ranger? What if he didn't want to talk about the past? What if he had forgotten him? Her stomach churned at the thought. No, she had to at least try. She took a breath, steadied herself, and pressed call. The line rang twice. Then a deep voice answered. Gruff, worn, and hesitant. Hello? Emma's mouth went dry. She forced herself to speak. Hi, is this Sergeant Jake Carter? A long pause. Who's asking? She swallowed. My name is Emma Carter. I think I have... She hesitated, her throat tight. I think I have your dog. Another long silence. Then his voice came back, but this time it was different. Shaky. Raw. Bravo? Emma's chest tightened. Ranger lifted his head at the name, his ears flicking toward the phone. You remember him? Emma whispered. Jake let out a breath that sounded like a man being punched in the gut. Are you telling me he's alive? Her heart clenched. Yes, he's here. He's been with me for 3 years. Another pause. This time when Jake spoke, his voice was broken. I thought I'd never see him again. The conversation lasted almost an hour. Jake told her about Bravo's past, the missions, the close calls, the soldiers he had saved. And then he told her the part that made Emma's blood run cold. Bravo wasn't retired because he was injured, Jake said bitterly. He was retired because I was. Emma's brows furrowed. What do you mean? Jake sighed. I got hit during a mission, took a bullet to the leg. It wasn't fatal, but it was enough to end my career. They discharged me, and Bravo was reassigned. Emma's throat tightened. So they just gave him away? Jake laughed, but it was a hollow, bitter sound. They didn't even let me say goodbye. One day, I was in the hospital recovering. The next, I got a letter saying he had been transferred. Emma felt a fresh wave of anger. He had been ripped away from the person he loved most, discarded like a used tool. She glanced down at Ranger, Bravo. He had been through so much, lost so much, and yet he had never once stopped protecting her. Emma took a deep breath. Would you want to see him again? The silence on the other end of the phone was deafening. Then, in a voice thick with emotion, Jake said, I'd give anything. A week later, Emma and Ranger boarded a plane to Montana. She had never left the city since her accident. The idea of traveling somewhere new, unfamiliar, and uncharted in her world of darkness should have terrified her. But she wasn't afraid, because Ranger was with her, because this wasn't just about her anymore, it was about him. She owed it to him to give him closure, to let him see the person he had once protected with his life, to let Jake see the dog he had never stopped loving. And maybe, just maybe, this would bring healing for all of them. As the plane took off, Emma placed a hand on Ranger's back and whispered, We're going home. The Montana air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth as Emma stepped off the plane. Even though she couldn't see the towering mountains in the distance or the sprawling fields stretching endlessly beyond the airport, she could feel it, the vastness, the openness, the unfamiliarity. For the first time since losing her sight, she was in a place that felt truly foreign. But she wasn't afraid, because Ranger was by her side. He walked beside her with the same measured pace he always did, his leash firm in her grasp. But there was something different about him today. He was alert, more than usual. His ears twitched at every sound, his nose flared slightly, and his body was tense, as if he knew, as if some part of him could already feel what was coming. Emma swallowed hard, gripping his harness. "Are you ready for this, boy?" she whispered. Ranger didn't respond, but she felt the slight press of his body against her leg, his quiet way of reassuring her. But she knew the truth. This wasn't about her. This was about him. They arrived at a small ranch on the outskirts of town where Sergeant Jake Carter was waiting. Emma could hear the crunch of boots against gravel as someone approached. The air around them shifted, heavy, thick with something unspoken. Then a voice she had only ever heard through the phone broke the silence. "Bravo?" The leash in Emma's hand jerked. Ranger froze. It was a single word, but it might as well have been a bullet through time. Emma felt Ranger's whole body go rigid, his ears snapping forward, his breathing quicker, sharper. For 3 years, she had never seen him react like this. She turned her head toward where she knew Jake was standing. "He remembers you," she whispered. Jake let out a choked breath, and then the leash slipped from Emma's fingers. The moment that changed everything. Ranger moved before she could even react. Not running, not charging. Just a strong, purposeful stride, his entire body drawn toward the voice that had once been his entire world. Jake took a slow step forward, his breath ragged, his hands trembled. He had told himself this wouldn't break him, that he was ready. But he had been lying. Because when Bravo, the dog he had spent years fighting alongside, bleeding alongside, surviving alongside, stood in front of him, all the years, all the distance, all the pain came crashing back. "Hey, buddy," Jake whispered. Ranger stopped just inches away, his head tilted slightly, uncertain. His nose twitched, searching, and then he knew. The deep, sharp bark erupted from his chest, his tail wagging furiously for the first time in years. He lunged forward, pushing against Jake with his massive frame, letting out another sharp, desperate sound. Jake stumbled back, laughing, a broken, gasping laugh that melted into a sob. "Oh God," he choked out, sinking to his knees, burying his face into Ranger's fur. Emma covered her mouth with her hands. She didn't need to see to feel the weight of this moment. This wasn't just a dog and his former handler. This was a reunion of 2 soldiers who had thought they had lost each other forever. Jake gripped the sides of Ranger's face, pressing their foreheads together. His voice was shaking, raw with emotion. "They told me you were gone." Ranger let out a low, soft whimper, a sound Emma had never heard from him before. Jake's fingers clenched into his fur. "I'm so sorry, buddy. I should have never let them take you. I should have fought harder." Ranger just stayed there, breathing him in, his tail still wagging slightly. And in that moment, it didn't matter how much time had passed, because to Ranger, Jake had never stopped being his home. Emma gave them time. She stood back, hands gripping the straps of her bag, as she listened to Jake talk to Ranger in hushed tones. She had never heard him sound like this before. So broken, so vulnerable, so relieved. Eventually, Jake stood, clearing his throat. I don't even know what to say," he admitted. Emma gave a small smile. "You don't have to say anything." Jake exhaled, his voice still thick. I can't believe it. I thought I lost him." Emma nodded slowly. "So did he." Jake glanced down at Ranger, who was still glued to his side, his tail wagging every time Jake so much as shifted. The dog who had been so calm, disciplined, silent in her presence, was suddenly alive in a way she had never witnessed before. "He never forgot you," she said quietly. Jake swallowed hard, nodding. "I never forgot him either." Emma hesitated. "Why did they separate you?" Jake's jaw tightened. "Because I got injured." Emma frowned. "But they don't give these dogs options, Emma," Jake cut in, his voice laced with anger, regret. "The moment I couldn't fight anymore, Bravo Ranger was reassigned. I was told I'd get to adopt him, but by the time I was discharged, he was already gone." Emma felt sick. All this time she had thought Ranger had been retired because of an injury or age. But no, he'd been taken, ripped away, discarded, and neither of them had been given a choice. Her fingers trembled as she reached down, threading through Ranger's fur. "That's not fair." Jake let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah, tell me about it." A beat of silence stretched between them. Then, quietly, Jake asked, "So what happens now?" Emma hesitated. She had thought about this moment over and over again, but now that it was here, she wasn't sure what the answer was, because this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about Ranger, the dog who had saved her, the dog who had once been Jake's world, the dog who had been forced to start over too many times. She swallowed hard. "What do you want to happen?" Jake exhaled slowly, looking down at Ranger. His eyes were filled with something deep and painful. "I want him to be happy," he said finally. "That's all I've ever wanted." Emma's fingers clenched slightly. "So do I." She could feel the weight of the decision pressing on her chest, because one of them would have to let him go. The crisp Montana air was filled with silence, the kind that spoke louder than words. Emma stood still, her hands gripping Ranger's leash, but for the first time in 3 years, she wasn't sure if she was meant to hold on to it. Jake stood just a few feet away, staring at the dog who had once been his world. And Ranger, Bravo, sat between them, caught in a moment neither of them had ever expected to face. For years, they had both loved him in different ways. For Jake, Ranger had been a brother in arms, a fellow soldier, a protector on the battlefield where trust meant survival. They had saved each other, risked their lives together, and had been torn apart by a system that had treated them as nothing more than pieces of a war machine. For Emma, Ranger had been her lifeline, her silent guardian, the only thing that had ever truly made her feel safe again after losing her sight. He had become her world in ways she hadn't realized until now, until she was faced with the possibility of losing him. And yet, Ranger couldn't have both of them. One of them had to let go. Jake sighed heavily, his fingers running through his short, graying hair. He looked down at Ranger, who had been sitting right at his feet since the reunion. His tail wagged slightly, his ears flicked up every time Jake moved, as if watching over him, just like before. "I don't know how to do this," Jake admitted, his voice strained. "I don't know how to look at him and walk away." Emma swallowed hard. "Neither do I." She could hear the emotion in his voice, the same ache that had been growing in her chest since the moment she realized what this reunion meant. Ranger wasn't just her dog. He had never really belonged to her. She had been given a soldier, a protector, a dog with a history far bigger than herself. And now, she had to face the impossible reality that maybe he wasn't meant to stay with her. Emma took a deep breath, forcing the words out. "He still loves you," she said softly. Jake nodded, swallowing hard. "I love him too, always have." The words hit Emma harder than she expected, because she had never heard anyone say them out loud before. She had always felt Ranger's loyalty, had known he cared for her in his own quiet way. But she had never let herself believe that she was capable of being loved by him the way Jake had been. Because Jake had been there in his past. She had only been a part of his second life. And yet, she loved him too, more than she had ever thought possible. Who deserved him more? Jake let out a slow breath and crouched beside Ranger, resting a hand on the dog's broad shoulders. Ranger leaned into his touch, his tail thumping softly against the dirt. "I wanted to come get you," Jake murmured, his voice cracking slightly. "I wanted to fight for you, but I never got the chance. They told me you were reassigned, and then after a while they told me you were gone." Emma flinched. "Gone?" Jake nodded. "That's what they say when they don't want to admit they lost track of these dogs. It happens more than people know. Some get adopted by civilians, some just disappear into the system." Emma's chest tightened, like he was just discarded. Jake's face darkened. "That's exactly what happened." Emma reached down and ran her fingers through Ranger's fur. He hadn't been discarded. Not to her. She had never seen him as broken or as something to be thrown away. She had seen him as her world, as the only thing that had ever given her a sense of freedom after she had lost everything. And now, she was expected to give him back. Jake exhaled. "I don't want to take him from you." Emma's heart clenched. "But you could." Jake was silent for a long moment. "Maybe, but that doesn't mean I should." His fingers clenched slightly in Ranger's fur before he finally stood up, his gaze shifting toward Emma. "This dog has been a soldier, Jake said, his voice steady now. He spent his life serving others, protecting, fighting. That's all he's ever known, until you. Emma's breath caught in her throat. Jake's eyes softened. I see the way he watches you. Emma hesitated. What do you mean? Jake's lips pressed together, as if he was still processing the words himself. I mean that for years, he was trained to follow orders, protect, obey. That's what he did for me. His gaze flicked down to Ranger. But with you? It's different. Emma frowned. Different how? Jake smiled, but it was sad, bittersweet. For the first time in his life, he said softly, he's just a dog. The words hit Emma like a tidal wave. She turned toward Ranger, reaching down as his wet nose nudged gently against her palm. She had never thought about it before, never realized what she had given him in return. He had given her safety, guidance, protection. But she had given him a life where he didn't have to be a soldier anymore. A life where he could just be. Jake's voice was softer now. He belongs with you, Emma. She sucked in a sharp breath, her eyes burning. Are you sure? Jake nodded. I miss him. Hell, I'll always miss him, but he's found his home. Emma's throat tightened. And what about you? Jake smiled, but it was laced with sadness. It's enough to know he's happy. Emma reached for Jake's hand, squeezing it tightly. Thank you, she whispered. Jake gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. Take care of him. He's been through more than most of us. Emma ran her fingers through Ranger's fur. I will. Jake crouched beside Ranger one last time, pressing his forehead gently against the dog's. You did good, Bravo, he murmured. Real good. Ranger let out a soft breath, his tail wagging once. And then, just like that, Jake stepped back. He turned, walking toward his truck without another word, his boots crunching softly against the gravel. Emma stood there for a long time, listening to the sound of his truck pulling away until it faded into the distance. Then, she knelt beside Ranger, wrapping her arms around him. It's just us again, buddy, she whispered. Ranger let out a soft huff, pressing his head into her shoulder. And in that moment, Emma knew. They had both lost things. They had both been forced to start over. But somehow, they had found each other. And neither of them would ever be alone again.
Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please support me by clicking the logo in the bottom right corner to subscribe to my channel. This way you won't miss any of the exciting stories coming up. Thank you so much.